Hello, this is Miss Dagenford, and I wanted to introduce you to our photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is something that you've probably learned before. And we know that plants take in carbon dioxide and produce glucose. But we want to go over the mechanisms by which this happens. So by the end of this video, you should know the major players involved in photosynthesis, the major steps, the processes, the cells, the organelles, and the pigments and what these pigments do. And then we're going to do a quick overview of the steps. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, with plants, we know, of course, we see the branch with the leaves on our screen. So if we take a look at this, we see the leaves. We can then break the leaves into a cross section. So this is a cross section of our leaf. All of these green cells would be plant cells that photosynthesize. And they're green because they have chloroplasts. So there are other leaf cells here, but they are a gray for a reason. They don't have as many chloroplasts or any. So if we break this picture down further, we can look at a microscope picture of a leaf cell. And so let's go ahead and drag our box. Follow along with your Google Slides. So here would be a leaf cell. And then if we were to take just one of these green organelles, we would see our chloroplasts. And so those are the major cells and organelles that we're going to look at. The parts of the plant that photosynthesize the most would be our leaf cells. And then within the leaf cells, it would be the chloroplasts that you just learned about in the previous lesson. Now, plants are called producers because they produce their own food. And that means they're converting the energy in sunlight to chemical energy stored in glucose, sucrose, fructose, any sugar or starch, any carbohydrate you can think of, plants can make. And so we're taking sunlight energy and converting it into chemical energy in bonds. Now, it's the chloroplasts that do that, and chloroplasts contain pigments to absorb these light wavelengths. Now, pigments, you've probably heard that word before, most likely in art class. You hear about the pigments in paints and color pencils and crayons. And pigments are pretty much any molecule that can absorb light wavelengths. And so it's this light energy that's absorbed by the electrons and pigments. And that's going to be the key. So think about the electrons that we learned about back in August, September. The electrons that we learned about, those electrons are moving around and they have a certain amount of energy. Well, when light energy hits them, they can get excited. They can move around more. They can jump to a different orbital in the atoms and the molecules. And so that's what we want to take a look at. Now, so let's take a look at our pigments and see what we can learn about there. So again, you learned about pigments probably in art class. Pigments are any molecule that absorbs some wavelengths of light and reflect others. So anything that you have in your vicinity that has color, that means there's a pigment that is reflecting some wavelengths back to you. So for instance, I've got this candy bar that's red. Well, the red wrapper has a pigment that's reflecting red wavelengths back to you. If it's green, then it's reflecting green wavelengths. And chlorophyll is a green pigment that is reflecting back green light, and that's why we see it as green. Now that means it absorbs other wavelengths. So let's take a look at our graph here. This is what we would call an absorption spectrum. And the x-axis would be the different wavelengths of light. And so you can see underneath that they've shown the spectrum of light. So you can see 700 nanometers would be the wavelengths of reds and orangey reds. And then we dip down into the 650 and we get into the orange and orangey red. And then 600 would be yellow, 550 would be green, and so forth and so on. The y-axis would be the amount of light absorbed. And so if we take a look at the green pigments, chlorophyll A and B, chlorophyll A and B absorb the blue wavelengths of light the most, and then the red. And so we can conclude that chlorophyll reflects green light but absorbs red and blue. So that would mean that plants photosynthesize best in red and blue and photosynthesize least in green. And there are different lab exercises that we can look at that would show that. Plants do have other pigments, of course. They have yellows and oranges. Carotenoids would be orangey yellow. Xanthophylls can be orangey yellow as well. And notice they absorb and reflect different pigments because they are different colors. Some of these pigments can help harvest some other light wavelengths, but mostly these pigments are also there to help protect the plant. Light energy can also be destructive. It can overheat the plant, it can cause damage to molecules, and so these carotenoids and xanthophylls can absorb this extra energy and dissipate it without damaging the plant. Now, there are going to be a couple of videos we watch in class, but for the sake of this video, we're not going to watch them in this video, but it has to do with autumn leaves and changing color. And then we're also going to watch these in class, and that's a lab on how we can separate these pigments, why it works, and what's happening in this chromatography. So let's talk about an overview of photosynthesis. So first we need to establish what in the world is happening in the chloroplast. Now you somewhat learned this in the last unit, but let's talk about our chloroplasts. Chloroplasts have an outer and inner membrane. They're not going to be as interesting to us. They don't really get involved in our photosynthesis. But it's the stuff that we have inside that's interesting. We have a stack of membranes called the granum. And that stack is going to be made of individual thylakoids. Now, that's just the weirdest word. Thylakoids would be just one. So notice in our diagram, they've highlighted one thylakoid green, and then the rest are in the granum. So granum is just simply a stack of thylakoids. And then all of these are going to be surrounded by this kind of dark green gray stroma. And the stroma is kind of a fluid, semi-fluid that bathes the granum. Now, both of these are going to be involved in the photosynthetic reactions, but we had to establish, again, the major players, what's going on with these. So let's take a look at our first reaction, and that would be our light reaction. So let's move to the light dependent. Now, the light dependent reaction, just as the name implies, is going to focus on capturing the light energy. That is its job. You have light energy coming down, and you want the plant to capture that light energy. And so that's what we're going to see here. So the energy from sunlight is absorbed, and in the process, we're going to get two energy molecules from this, ATP and NADPH. Now, these are long words, so we abbreviate them, and we've already talked about ATP, and we're going to talk about NADPH when we get into more detail here. But again, this video is just to give you an introduction. Now, the only other thing we need to establish is the role of water and oxygen. So there we have sunlight coming in. We're going to capture sunlight, and we're going to capture sunlight and convert that energy to two intermediates, ATP and NADPH. In the process, we're going to take water molecules and break them down into oxygen, electrons, and hydrogen ions. Basically, we're just going to break water apart. H2O, hydrogen, oxygen, and then electrons. And then we'll talk about the job of each of these. So why we know that photosynthesis makes sugars, but I don't see sugars yet. What's going on with that? Well, we aren't. We need a second reaction to do that, and that would be our light independent reaction. So on slide 19, we have our stage 2, which is a light independent reaction. This is also called the Calvin cycle. And the Calvin cycle, as you can guess, it was kind of disseminated by a scientist. His name was Melvin Calvin, and all of his lab assistants back in, oh gosh, I'm going to have to look that up. Broke it down, won a Nobel Prize for breaking down all the parts of the Calvin cycle. So the job of the Calvin cycle is to utilize that ATP and NADPH, use the energy from them to make glucose. And so what you're going to see in the light independent reaction is carbon dioxide. And again, follow along on your slides. Go ahead and move your labels. Carbon dioxide, which then is captured in that Calvin cycle and used to make glucose. So that is our goal in our light independent reaction. So there you have it, the two main stages, light dependent reaction, capturing the sunlight energy and making our energy molecules, ATP and NADPH, and then the stage 2, light independent reaction, that's going to utilize those energy molecules to make glucose. All right, well, we're going to get into a little bit more detail in our next lesson.